Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 49. In this week's episode, I want to talk about breadcrumbs and healing fantasies. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine about a week ago about staying in friendships and relationships when 90% of the time you're not enjoying yourself, when you only really like 10% of that person. And yet that 10% is enough to keep you in that friendship or in that relationship. We were kind of asking ourselves why we have found ourselves in these positions in the past, where we don't necessarily feel held by these friendships or these relationships, and yet we continue to stick around. Immediately, it brought to my mind the idea of breadcrumbs, breadcrumbing as a behavior. In the research that I've done about breadcrumbing, it's often talked about in the context of a romantic relationship, stringing someone along with minimal amounts of attention or affection or effort, just enough to keep them around, to keep them from leaving. And while I do think that this is common in romantic relationships, I do think that it's important to discuss breadcrumbing as a behavior and how it applies to a parent-child relationship, because I absolutely think that it's relevant, especially when you're dealing with narcissistic or emotionally immature parents. But I think sometimes, instead of just receiving breadcrumbs of attention or affection from a parent, you might receive breadcrumbs of healthy behavior. And I want to get into that a little bit later. But first, one of the really important things to understand about breadcrumbing is that it creates a power dynamic. I think another way to call this behavior is intermittent reinforcement. I think this other way of describing this behavior is particularly relevant in a parent-child relationship, because you start to understand that this person, the person that is taking care of you, that you depend on for the necessities of life, the basics, they are capable of giving you the things that you want and need when they see fit, when they feel that you are deserving of those things. And I think throughout childhood, we're so adaptable. I think we're really able to pick up on these different patterns, and we're able to understand very quickly what we need to do in order to receive those breadcrumbs of affection, attention, or sometimes healthy behavior from our parent. And I think when you exist in such a vacuum that can be created by an emotionally immature parent, it can be so easy for these different patterns, identifying them and tailoring your personality to them, to really dominate your identity and to dictate your actions, the way that you feel and the things that you do. More often than not, I think when an emotionally immature parent gives their child a breadcrumb of something positive, there is a likelihood that it's coming from a self-centered place. Maybe they want to feel loved or needed, and so they are giving out attention in the hope of receiving that same attention in return. Maybe they're using you to meet their own emotional needs. Maybe they need a bit of an ego boost, and so they want to sort of feel that power dynamic that can be created when you have one person who is dishing out the affection and another person who is craving it, who is doing everything in their power to be on the receiving end of it. I think it's also probable that receiving a breadcrumb of something positive from a parent might come at a very convenient time for them. I know throughout my childhood, there was a very obvious team dynamic that was present for most of my life. And a narcissistic or an emotionally immature parent, I think, sometimes can prey on that divide. They can create the divide and they can further that divide and do different things within your relationship to secure your loyalty, to make sure that they've got you on their side. And I think that there are times when a parent might anticipate that they need your support, that they need to know that when this conversation comes up or when this thing happens, you will be there to back them. And I think one of the ways that they can ensure that that happens is by giving you a breadcrumb of affection or of attention or of healthy behavior. Maybe they actually comfort you, or they do something that appears to be purely kind and there isn't any sort of malicious intent behind it on the surface. Before we've developed the emotional maturity to understand where this behavior might be coming from, I think it can be so easy to just naively take these breadcrumbs and to think that they are really substantial, that they are the start of a massive shift in your parents' behavior, and to be really happy about it and to not question it, because questioning it might upset your parent and it might undo this little bit of progress that you believe to be witnessing. I've talked about this before, but I do think that it's important to reinforce here. One of the most malicious aspects of this kind of emotional abuse, specifically within a parent-child relationship, is that the adult in the relationship is intentionally manipulating the innocence of their child. And I think that is one of the worst things that you can do. Using a child's love for their parent as a weapon to gain control over them and to manipulate them, it's awful. And yet that is the reality for so many of us. And that's why it's important to understand these behaviors better so that we don't continue to get sucked into this cycle. I think another one of the ways that an emotionally immature parent might breadcrumb you is through something called future faking. And this is something that I'm sure a lot of us have experienced, where a parent either promises you that in the future things will be better or things will be different. Or maybe they say that they've planned for this really positive, exciting thing to happen a few months from now. They promise you that if you do this one thing for them right now, then I will help you out in the future. And so they kind of string you along. And again, I think throughout childhood, I know I wanted to believe my parents. I wanted to believe that their intentions were good. And so it was that much easier, I think, for me to give in to that kind of behavior and to believe those empty promises because I wanted to have faith that they would actually come to fruition. And no matter how many times those promises were not kept, I still held out hope that the next time it would be different. I was caught up in this cycle of breadcrumbing. I had the hope, and these little bits of positive reinforcement were enough for me to keep going, to keep trying, and to keep believing that not only things would be different, but at the very least that they could be different. This is something that I think a lot of us experience, this false sense of power, thinking that if we do something differently, then things might change. We think that somehow the solution to all of our family's problems is in our hands, and it can be a really dangerous thing when you take on that responsibility and you actually believe that you have that power. Another thing that I want to mention about receiving breadcrumbs from your parents is that it keeps them on your mind. I think just enough so that you don't cut them off, just enough so that you don't feel justified in going no or low contact or distancing yourself in one way or another. In Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, Lindsay Gibson talks about how a common fantasy among children of emotionally immature parents is that their parents will have a change of heart and they will finally care and they will finally show concern. And this is what kept me stuck for so long. I think throughout my childhood, I took on the responsibility of managing my parents' emotions. I did that because I believed that I was being a good kid by making my parent happy. I was also convinced that I was my parents' best friend, that they didn't have anyone else. And so it was my responsibility to be there for them and to help them work through these really difficult things in their life that they're going through. Not once did I ever stop and think, I shouldn't have to worry about these adult problems that I didn't cause, that I can't fix. I should be living my life as a kid. And yet anytime I would do something and I would receive a bit of positive reinforcement from my parent, no matter how small, it made me feel good. And it sent a message to my brain that I was doing the right thing, that I should do more of that. Over time, when you adopt this kind of behavior, and you do receive breadcrumbs of positive reinforcement, of affection, or of healthy behavior from your parent, I think that can be enough to keep that hope alive, that your parent will have a change of heart, that things will get better, that there is something that you can do. And that undoubtedly got me caught up in this cycle. And I didn't even realize what was going on because I just thought that that was my responsibility and that if I ever stopped trying, I would be giving up on my parent or I would be giving up on my family. This is where the idea of healing fantasies comes into play and how they sort of go hand in hand, I think, sometimes with these breadcrumbs that we receive from our parents. Throughout my childhood, mainly throughout my teenage years, I was consumed with thoughts of my life in the future. I always thought that when I met someone, things would change. Maybe when I graduated school and went to college, things would change. I think I always daydreamed of a time in my life when things would be different. And I always assumed that that would be marked by some drastic change in my life. And more often than not, it was centered around a relationship. And I don't think I ever put two and two together that the relationship that I was fantasizing about, that I was obsessing over, this hypothetical future relationship with a person that I had never met, was sort of defined by all of the characteristics that my relationship with my parents was lacking. It wasn't until realizing my trauma and learning about healing fantasies that I understood just how much these two things related to one another. I so badly wanted to be in a relationship with someone who would see me for who I truly was. I wanted to feel held, and I wanted someone to be there for me always. I wanted someone that I could go to with anything and we could talk about it. I wanted to be able to share my deepest fears and insecurities, things that I was uncertain about, and be met with understanding or interest and enthusiasm. So much of my mental energy throughout my teens was consumed with the idea of this ideal hypothetical relationship. In a lot of ways, I think as challenging as healing fantasies can be as we get older and we move into real relationships, I think in the moment, it's a very powerful way for us to cope with the pain that comes along with the emotional loneliness of being raised by an emotionally immature parent. And looking back, the idea that something like that existed and the potential for me experiencing that in the future absolutely kept me going through some really challenging times in my life. I don't think I ever connected those dots and understood that what I was seeking was what I deserved, and it was also what I was lacking from the people that I currently had relationships with. I think if I had connected those dots sooner, it would have opened my eyes to how unhealthy and how unfair a lot of the behavior that I was being exposed to and enduring truly was. And there might be an element of guilt that's responsible for that. Maybe I didn't want to see my parents' behavior for what it truly was, because that would be devastating. And so I rationalized it. I kept those two things completely separate, and I didn't think that the things that I wanted, that I was craving from this other imaginary relationship, I should already have in my relationship with my parents. I think I always imagined how wonderful it would be to experience these things for the first time, but I never thought that I should be exposed to unconditional love and empathy and compassion now, throughout my childhood, throughout my teens, from my parents, to prepare me for a relationship, to show me that it's possible, and to show me the kind of behavior that I should accept from another person. And yet, the behavior that I was expecting from this imaginary person that I wanted nothing more than to meet, because I was convinced that when I met this person, my life would completely change and it would be so much better, was actually the opposite of what I had grown used to. And I didn't understand just how wrong that was. I think one of the reasons that we develop healing fantasies, which are basically, I guess, for a more straightforward definition, healing fantasies are ideas of how our unmet emotional needs will be fulfilled in the future. I think one of the reasons that we develop healing fantasies when we're raised by an emotionally immature parent is because we have to adjust to our parents' emotional limitations, which can be incredibly lonely, especially if you are a more sensitive child. I think highly sensitive children can be very compassionate and insightful and intuitive, and we come to understand very quickly that we need to be the adult, the mature one in our relationship with our parents, and so we become little grown-ups, wise beyond our years, and we take on a lot of undue responsibilities and burdens. Like I mentioned earlier, I think developing these healing fantasies is a way for us to cope with that emotional loneliness and with never truly feeling held by our parents. But I think what can be really dangerous and damaging about healing fantasies is that we come to believe that we need to become someone other than ourselves in order to receive love and care. And this is a consistent theme when you are raised by an emotionally immature parent. Personally, I was reflecting on this idea throughout my own life and my own childhood, and particularly throughout my teenage years when these healing fantasies were especially present. I found myself sort of obsessed with the process of becoming. I took on and pursued a lot of interests. I think I was very aware of the things that I was doing in my life and the way that I was perceived by others. I almost felt like I had to stack my cards to prove that I was worthy of this fantasy that I had dreamt of, that I wasn't inherently deserving of that kind of love or relationship. And so I sort of became obsessed, I think, with this process of becoming a better version of me, a different version of me that would maybe appeal to the kind of person that I wanted to attract, that I wanted to bring into my life. It's interesting because I think that there's a duality to this obsession and to this process. I think on one hand, it can lead to some personal development. I think it's important to take interest in different things and to try new things and to try to evolve into a better version of yourself, maybe a bit more well-rounded. But I think at the same time, when you're not necessarily motivated by your own personal goals, you're motivated by something external, I think that is when things start to get a little muddy. You might be doing the right things, but not for the right reasons. Personal development is a positive, but I think you also have to be doing it for personal reasons. Otherwise, and especially I think when you come from this kind of environment, it can be so easy for you to directly tie your self-worth to external factors. I think the sooner you realize that By allowing external factors that are beyond your control to dictate your own personal development, you are essentially putting your self-worth and your happiness in someone else's hands. And that is not a sustainable way to live. Lindsay Gibson also talks about the idea of a role self. And I think this goes hand in hand. I think it is directly related to both breadcrumbs and healing fantasies. Essentially, our role self is a version of ourselves that we create that is better suited to someone else in our life. It's a persona or a personality that we adopt or take on. It may evolve over time to make someone else in our life happy and to receive positive reinforcement from them. A lot of times it can be a way for us to find a role within our family and to sort of coexist with other members of our family. I think the development of a role self is a prime example of tying your self-worth and the way that you feel about yourself, even your own personal development, the things that you take interest in, that you're pursuing, to external factors, mainly your parents. What do they want from you? What do they want you to do? What are the things that you do that make them happy? I think throughout childhood, again, it can be so easy to kind of recognize these patterns and to take that positive reinforcement and run with it, and to allow those patterns to become such a dominant part of who you are and the way that you live your life. And when this is sort of bolstered by the idea of a healing fantasy, that if you do this thing or you become this version of yourself, then you will be on the receiving end of all of these things that you believe yourself to be deserving of, it can be so difficult to realize that you've adopted this role self and then to break out of it. I think also when we find ourselves taking on these different personas and adopting these different roles throughout childhood, that can be what becomes expected of us. And so anytime we stray from that role, we might be met with resistance, which can make it that much harder to break out of this persona that might actually be inauthentic. I think once we start to understand more about our trauma, and specifically healing fantasies, role selves, it's important that we ask ourselves, who are we trying to be? And who have we been and why? And I think allowing yourself time and space to sit with those questions and to answer them can really help to move forward and to start to understand a bit more about who your authentic self is. Now that I am in a healthy relationship and a safe environment, I no longer find myself obsessing over healing fantasies. I have goals and aspirations for my future. I have things that I want to achieve in my life, but these things that I envision aren't filling a void in my current life. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make. There's also much less time where I feel compelled to play a role or to adopt a certain persona because I believe that that is what will be best received by the people that I'm around. And I recognize that that is through no fault of my company, but it's something that I've done for so long that it's become sort of ingrained in my way of thinking and in my behavior. And it's not something that you can just turn off. So it takes practice showing up in friendships and relationships and group settings and understanding who you are in those moments, who you want to be, who you feel comfortable being, and actually having the courage or the ability to show up as that person. I think sometimes letting go of our role selves can be really scary because we open ourselves up to judgment of our authentic self, which can be deeply painful to be on the receiving end of. I think one of the things that we learn throughout childhood is that being rewarded for being inauthentic feels better than being judged for being authentic. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to fight against that. No matter how painful it might be to be on the receiving end of that kind of judgment for who you truly are, other people's perception of you is a mirror. It's a reflection of how they truly feel about themselves. And I don't want any of you to feel discouraged from being your true selves, from showing your true selves to others because of the way that someone has made you feel in the past. I think it is so important to understand that someone who is going out of their way to make you feel less than probably feels less than themselves, and they're doing that to try to make themselves feel better. One of the interesting things about resolving childhood trauma in adulthood is understanding just how much it informs your personality, the way that you show up in friendships and relationships, the way that you feel about yourself and others. It's applicable to so many different aspects of our lives, and allowing ourselves to be strung along, sticking around for that 10%, obsessing over an imaginary relationship or friendship, and taking on a persona that you know will be more agreeable to the people that you're around. These are all just a few of them. So please don't let someone make you feel any less than, or make you feel bad or weird or different for being who you truly are. Don't let anyone get in the way of you being your authentic self. With practice and in time, this will all be a bit easier. And so I encourage you to ask yourself, are you playing a role right now? If so, what is that role and why? How does that role differ from who you truly are? And what would change if you showed up as a more authentic version of yourself? With that, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I'll be back next week with the 50th episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast.